Hey everyone, it is Kyle once again with the Margins podcast, and I am so stoked to be here today with you all, but also with my friend John,
What's up?
my friend Emily, my friend Michael. Good to see y'all. How we doing?
Swell.
Doing good.
The faithful four, right?
Yeah.
The rest have decided to go on vacation this
Fantastic
week.
Four.
Fantastic Four. Nah, you're trying to make it worldly, brother. We're trying to keep it,
I apologize, brother. Let me get back in
faithful
the spirit.
four. You feel me?
Yeah.
We don't mess with superheroes. No, I'm kidding.
Thanks.
I'm being silly, but we're excited to be with you guys today. And to the rest of the friends who usually join us, we just ask that you would keep them in prayer. No, they're all busy season for pastors right now as we kind of head into the fall. And so today, though, as we are meeting and gathering, I'm excited because we're looking at a story that kind of stumped all of us a bit as we started breaking the text down and what we wanted to do and study. Reminder again that we are talking about Ekklesia and church. We're looking at this concept of community, this concept of the gathering of the church. Is it worth it? What happens when it happens? And so there's lots of questions we've had. And one of those stories that I've gravitated toward, and I know our team talked about a lot in the planning, was a story found in 2 Samuel 6, where our boy David doesn't just dance, but he dances a little naked. And so it's a little bit of a crazy story. You may wonder how this applies to faith and church and ecclesia and community building within it. But I think that's the beauty, is we'll find out and we'll discover. And so we're going to jump right into the text. I'm going to have a word of prayer for us as we begin. And then Emily is going to read the first 4 verses or first 6? First 4 verses for us. And then Nixon is going to read 12 to 23. So if you're tracking with us in your Bible, that's where we're going to be hanging out, 1 through 4. We're not trying to cut anything out in the middle. We just want to focus on where David was getting his groove on today. So I'm going to pray and then we'll get into it. God, we come to you right now. We thank you for everyone listening. We thank you for those of us who are on the podcast and are just here to discuss your word and let it change us and form us and move us. And so today, let it teach us something new about what it means to be a church and to gather. We ask for your word to speak. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Story, 2 Samuel chapter 6. And for those of your Bibles, we're reading from the English Standard Version, the ESV. Bit of context, David is returning the Ark of the Covenant back into its rightful place. So goes as follows. David again gathered all the chosen men of Israel, 30,000. And David arose and went with all the people who were with him from Baal, Judah, to bring up from there the ark of God, which is called by the name of the Lord of hosts, who sits enthroned on the cherubim. And they carried the ark of God on a new cart and brought it out of the house of Abinadab, which was on the hill. And Uzzah and Ahio, the sons of Abinadab, were driving the new cart with the ark of God, and Ahio went before the ark.
Okay, jumping down to verse 12. And it was told King David, the Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the ark of God. So David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom to the city of David with rejoicing. And when those who bore the ark of the Lord had gone 6 steps, he sacrificed an ox and a fattened animal. And David danced before the Lord with all his might, and David was wearing a linen ephod. So David and all the house of Israel brought up the ark of the Lord with shouting and with the sound of the horn. As the ark of the Lord came into the city of David, Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. And they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent that David had pitched for it. And David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. And when David had finished offering the burnt offerings and the peace offerings, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts and distributed among all the people, the whole multitude of Israel, both men and women, a cake of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins to each one. Then all the people departed, each to his house. And David returned to bless his household. But Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David and said, "How the king of Israel honored himself today, uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants, female servants, and one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself." And David said to Michal, "It was before the Lord who chose me above your father and above all his house to appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord, and I will celebrate before the Lord. I will make myself yet more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in your eyes. But by the female servants of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor." And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. Mercy.
I'm not going to lie. As you were reading Michal, the place that I jumped ahead, but then the place I kept staying at was what you just read, David's explanation as to why he's doing what he's doing here. And I bring that up because I think it spurs us into the conversation and discussion well. So David has just danced in the street, right? He's danced a little naked. He's exposed himself to some people. And his response in verse 21 is kind of like, "Hey, the Lord said I'm king. You feel me?" Like it was before the Lord who chose me above your father and above all his house. Like, oh, relax. To appoint me as prince over Israel, the people of the Lord. And I will celebrate before the Lord. Now, he wasn't wrong, right? So I guess my question is, talking about Ekklesia and church, and even last week we talked a lot about pastors. Do pastors ever do this? Do we ever do things that might be a bit out of pocket or out of turn and then justify it because we're the pastor? Or have we seen elders do that? Have we seen, I guess, this power dynamic exist in the church, whether it's an elder or a pastor, or they did something or they do something and it's kind of justified in their eyes because of their position? You guys know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, I think it definitely exists in the church. I think it goes beyond the walls of the church though, right? I mean, like, I think people in positions of power feel justified to do many things. We live in a system and in a world where your positional authority really is the end all be all for so many people. And so I think that can justify a great many things, good and bad, unfortunately.
I agree with that, bro. I think it's good that you mentioned that it's not just an issue in the church. And particularly what I'm thinking about, I'm not trying to single out any denomination or people, but my family's Roman Catholic, and this is not intended to be anything about Roman Catholic people, but some of them experienced some abuse, right? And it was kind of like covered up in a way that was a bit like, hey, like, we're the church. So like God is, you really want to like hurt the church, that kind of thing. And I'm not trying to put something on the text that isn't here, but I think that's why David's words jump out to me a bit, because it almost can feel like he's being a little like, you know, he's kind of just justifying. But is that what he was doing in the context of the story? What do you guys think? What was he actually doing here?
Yeah, I kind of read it in a different way, but I definitely see how like this can definitely be applied to someone in a position of power using their supposed anointing to excuse bad behavior. But really,
well, that's even with the assumption that what he did was bad behavior.
Yeah,
right?
and I think that
the naked part is more what I'm talking about. Yeah. Like, I think people could apply what I said to the dancing part, and that's another thing we need to get into. I just think, I don't know, when I was I like to keep my clothes on.
I like to get my clothes on too.
Praise the Lord.
What I was kind of reading, maybe this is wrong, but what I was kind of reading as David just being so utterly joyful before the Lord and dancing and he had such a close relationship with God. And I think that part of that had to do with him being a sinful person, but then also confessing his sins to God. Like his sin, which all of us have, like his sin wasn't a, oh my goodness, I'm just going to continue to bow down in shame, but his sin and then his perpetual confession, I think, continually drew him closer to God. And so that's why God would call him a man after his own heart. And I almost look at Michal's condemnation of David, looking at that with jealousy. Like, I wish maybe I had what he had. And I was kind of viewing it as Michal condemning him of I wish I had what you had, but then it comes out as condemnation. And I see sometimes that happens. I know that will happen myself sometimes, where I will see someone who has such a close relationship with God, or seeing someone living out their relationship with God in a beautiful way, and me being jealous of what they have, and then inwardly condemning them and trying to pick apart and see what something might be wrong with how they're expressing themselves before God. I noticed that, full confession, I do that in my heart, and I've also observed that with other people. And so I wonder if this was a moment of jealousy of David's reaction. I don't know. That's something that I saw in it.
No, I appreciate your words, Emily. Oh, sorry.
No, go ahead, John.
I was going to say, I appreciate your words, because I think that you're right. And it's so blinding for Michal that she doesn't see the good that comes out of this expression of worship. Like, at a time when food insecurity, throughout most of history, food insecurity is a reality, right? And the worship that David has results in a distribution of food for the people of Israel. Like, the people who are in the highest class to the lowest class, like, it's like everybody is receiving food. Like, that is such a beautiful expression of worship to God, that, like, oh, we're showing what the kingdom should look like, right? It's like, and her maybe jealousy, what the text explains is her hatred, blinds her of all of that and says, you were dancing and that's horrible, when she's ignoring the good that has come out of it, the true worship, I would argue, that comes out of it, which is the distribution of food to those who might have gone days without food. You know, it's this blessing, and it's this beautiful, I think, moment where we see, like, the heart of God shine through more than the dancing.
Well, and Nix, I know you have something, but just to kind of tie the knot on what you're saying, John, that's kind of what I was seeing, is like, at first it can look like this guy just foolishly kind of, I'm the king, right? But I think the deeper thing I have to wrestle with, and we all have to wrestle with, is what were his motives, right? Like, was his motive just to, like, I'm naked, what's up? No, he wore, like, heavy gowns and chains and all these different things, right? He probably wore something on his head. I wonder if it was more offensive to the people that he took off, right, like his garb, than it was him showing. And I think when we look at it, like, through the lens of Michal, or Michal, however you want to say it, I've heard it said 9 different ways. It says, a commentator says this, and then I'll go to you, Mike, but she did not see the celebrating nation or the demonstration and recognition of God's glory. She did not notice the ark or rejoice in acknowledgement of God's presence. She saw only David behaving in a way that she viewed as indecent. And I think that's really telling, because it shows that she didn't, looking at it now, not from the perspective of what is this crazy pastor doing, but looking at it through the eyes of David, she never checked his motives. She never asked him about the condition of his heart. Why was he dancing? Why did he take the ephod off? Why, the why, I don't think, was wrestled with. But Mike, what were you going to say?
No, that's well said. And I think part of what we see here, as we're thinking about, like, how we apply it to Ekklesia and our gatherings now, is just the importance of understanding, like, relational dynamics. And so I feel like there's a couple of things at play here with Michal. So number one, she's Saul's daughter. And there's so much about the reign of King David that was set up as the counter Saul. I mean, from the very beginning, Saul has killed his thousands, David his tens of thousands. Okay. So there's that. And she's married to David, who, as he states here, was chosen over top of, Jonathan or any other heir of Saul's throne, just due to how Saul abdicated his responsibility as king. David becomes the person to be chosen to carry the kingdom forward. And so you have to think of, Michal not just as David's wife, but as Saul's daughter. And so to your point of what the commentator is speaking to around her viewing his behavior as indecent, you also have to assume that she's comparing that to the behavior of her father. Now, there are obviously negative things that Saul did to lose that lineage, but she likely grew up seeing him in that regal garb as someone who, really had a healthy respect for that position in a way that she's perceiving David to not in this moment where he's taking that garb off to dance. I'm quickly reminded of, when David's going to go out to face Goliath and he meets Saul and Saul tries to give him his armor, and David says, no, I got to go in my own armor. Like I can't go in what you're wearing. And so, and again, I'm, reading all kinds of stuff into the dynamic, but you could even in your mind's eye think now, she seeing him, it's almost like, oh, you're disrespecting my father's garb again. It's not good enough for you to wear as king. Like you have the position and you're out here in linen in front. And then there's a whole other dynamic of, she mentions the female servants and David responds to that. So there's some subtle tones there of, okay, you have these women looking at you a certain way. And we know about David's womanizing history, which led him to, kill Uriah and power rape Bathsheba. Okay. So there's all this backdrop, I think, in the relational dynamic. And how does that now impact her relationship as the king's wife, as queen, in this situation? And to your point, Kyle, thinking about it now from the standpoint of pastoral leadership and ministry, how does a spouse maybe deal with a situation where their spouse is behaving in a way that's indecent to them, while even though in the midst of that, as John was pointing out, there was this amazing outpouring of gift to the people, and maybe that was maybe more the main point. But how do you handle the relational dynamics that surround that? That's a very real human thing. And so I look at this with maybe a bit of empathy to Michal, for sure. I think the passive aggressiveness with how she brought up her issue was part of David. It isn't responsible for David's response. Everyone has to own their own words. But you could see that kind of being a precursor to how he lashed back, was the way that she kind of dismissively said, "Oh, what a display today! What a royal kingly way for you to present yourself to the people." And then you see David's sort of frustrated response. I would imagine that there's been a buildup here to this exchange as well, given all the different dynamics I was just sharing.
It's really I think to me, it boils down to when you see the person in the church lobby. This was a big thing in my home church growing up. I grew up in St. Louis, and
we were just talking about St. Louis.
I know don't go there. It's not, go to Kansas City. But
Michael's favorite city? Was that it?
What's that?
Michael's favorite city?
Oh, yeah.
That's right.
Yeah. That's what we're talking about.
Yeah.
I've been telling JFit it's time to have a one project here, so we got to make that happen right in the middle of the States.
Yeah.
But in my church, anyways, because we're in the middle, you would have people show up at church that were blue collar. It's it wasn't that they came wearing a short skirt. It was just that's the clothes they wear. It's how they dressed. And you'd have someone kind of go up and be like, hey, there'd actually be people saying things. And I think I think putting it in that context is helpful because, at least for me, it's easy for me to excuse the motives of the person wearing the short skirt or coming in a pair of jeans and a, messed up t-shirt someone might be upset with or something. I guess where it connects to me with the story is, can I see the side of the person I disagree with through like a lens of their motive might not be horrible. You know what I'm saying? Like it's no, I hope all of us agree, like going up to someone in the church lobby and being like, that is not the right thing to wear is not the move, right? I don't think that's of the gospel. I think that's evil to do that. But am I able to stop and sit and say, you know what? What's the motive behind why they're doing that and saying that to me? And that's a very hard thing to ask. I find trouble doing that as a pastor. Like I'll get asked, why don't you wear a suit? And I want to be like, because who wears it? I want to have some smart mouthy thing to say. But something that kind of stands out to me is that, like, for Michael, David's exposure, it was unacceptable because he was kind of like setting aside his kingliness, his dignity. And for David, it was just something he was doing, and the nakedness came kind of as an unintentional side effect. And so it's making me just kind of look at the way that I view both sides of the line, like the person coming up to me with a negative thing and the person going up to someone with something I agree about. Am I able to see that their intention might be good, but then also am I willing to say, that's not okay to do, man. Come over here. Let's chat about that. Because that's also a part of community and holding space for each other, I think.
Yeah.
And that was a long exposition, and I feel like I said nothing.
No, and I think that, like, to that person that you're talking about, the person who is quick to accuse, and kind of what Michael was talking about is I actually think that you gain a lot of credibility and respect when you actually sit with them and hear their story, because I often find the reason why they are like that, it's maybe not, I hate to say it, but maybe no fault to their own. Maybe it was kind of bad theology that we were brought up with, or I know of, one person at the church that I came from, and I love this person to bits and pieces. But her approach to Sabbath was very different from my approach to Sabbath, but it was because she explained it to me, and she came from a communist country where they have to fight for their Sabbath. And so for her, it's something that she has had to fight for her entire life. So her approach is fundamentally different. And when I heard her story and she explained it, it just made so much sense to me. And I had a moment of apology for her. But I think that a lot of people who have that approach, there's a story behind it. And when you hear their story behind it, you have so much compassion. You're like, oh, this is why they're doing it that way. I also know, like, this might be a broad stroke, and maybe you guys push back on this, but this is just kind of an observation that I've had. But I've noticed that a lot of people who are older, but who converted to Adventism in their adult life, anything that mirrors their life before Adventism is a trigger to them, and they don't want anything a part of it. And so then instead of having compassion on the person who has the ripped jeans or who's wearing the earrings or drinking a cup of coffee or the worship music that has a little bit of a beat, instead of going about it compassionately and thinking, oh, this person, whatever, to them, it's triggering for them because it's mirroring their previous life. And I don't have a solution on how to help that person. Well, but I don't know if that's been your guys' experience at all, but that's just something that I've noticed.
Not just with elderly or older people. It's been with, like, even for me, like, there were some guys I went to union with, and some of them had just left the world, as they would, say.
Yeah.
And they were anti everything. And it was almost like, there's this, like, when you grow up poor and you make it out, right? There's kind of this idea that I made it out. Like, I made it out of that circumstance. I've made it to a better place. And I feel like it's almost a similar mindset that people apply. Yeah, I made it out. if, you got to pull yourself up to make it out. You got to make choices and decisions. And I love what you're saying, Emily, because I think that's dangerous when we make it like a destination that we've arrived at, and man, they haven't arrived at it yet. So I don't know. It's weird, but we all do it in our own way.
It's true.
Yeah, I'm reminded of our discussion. And we were talking before the show how we've like randomly talked about death a lot in some of our different stories. But thinking back to the story of Cain and Abel and how, Cain has that exchange with God where he talks about, evil is at your doorstep. Like, you need to be careful.
Yeah.
I sort of see a similar dynamic in verse 16 where it talks about Michal looking down from the window, seeing David leaping and dancing before the Lord, and she despised him in her heart. And it was like, before the exchange even happens, like that was the critical point for her, where it was like, I'm going to see what you're doing. And, because someone acting in a way that maybe is uncomfortable for you, that's different, that you may even disagree with, I think that's natural. That's part of the human condition. That's part of contextualizing it for us in a faith community. Like, there's going to be things that you don't like or that you disagree with.
It's always going to happen.
It's always going to happen. And so it's a part of it. And as your relationship to that person gets closer, it can be more impactful, I think. So, I grew up as a PK. So I watched my dad my whole life be a minister. I have, family members who are ministers, that kind of thing. And so if one of those persons were to act in a way that I disagree with, which has happened, like I haven't agreed with all my dad's sermons, that sits with you differently. I don't know that I can confidently say that hasn't turned into like hatred or like despising per se. Maybe you despise your parents at different times for other reasons. I definitely have done that. But that starts at the heart level, and then it informs, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. And so that's kind of the critical point there. So the takeaway that I have is, when someone does something that I don't agree with, that I think is completely wrong, that could lead me to distaste the person. How do I hit the pause button before I say something, or I word something in a way that can lead to the degradation of that relationship, which I think is the whole point of Ekklesia at the foundation. It's the relationships we're building with people.
Yeah.
Well, maybe
I love that.
It's so real at times because, like, we all are taught as a kid, like, don't say mean things to each other, say kind things to one another, treat others the way you would be treated. And I think what makes this really sticky and really difficult is that for a lot of people, especially the people that are willing to go up to someone and call them out on what they're wearing or something, I genuinely believe sometimes they think that is the most loving, compassionate, amazing thing you could ever do, because why would you not want to be taken out of darkness? Why would you not want to know the truth? It changed my life. You just need someone. And I think like, as we're kind of transitioning into the last couple of minutes of this, it's crazy how fast this goes every week. But as we're transitioning to the end, something I'm taking away, and I'd love to hear your guys' thoughts, kind of like final takeaways on church and faith and life in the faith. I wonder if for Michal, if that kind of royalty or that dignity that she had experienced with Saul was like all she had left. If it was like all she was like clinging to, like that identity was her identity, it was like all she could hang her hat on. And look at David just making a mess of it. He's not even honoring traditions, he's exposing himself. And it's challenging me. It's easy to say we need to ask the people in the church, is their heart that way? But I need to ask myself, what am I hanging on to in the community, in the fellowship of believers, that's causing me to see people differently, that's causing me to not see their motives, but to see just their actions? There's a lot of things I think, but I think acknowledging that and being able to let go of whatever that is for you, that thing you're hanging on to for dear life. Like if you're, and what I mean by this, I think, and then I'll pass it off to someone else, is I've noticed this trend, and I think we've talked about it on here before, how oftentimes people who kind of have the craziest pasts have some of the craziest theology. And oftentimes it's like an attempt to control. So my life has felt very out of control. It's felt a mess. Now here are these rules and these disciplines that I can apply to my life that bring it into control. And I almost wonder if sometimes we get more attached and married to the section or the doctrine or the whatever sect of Christianity we belong to. I wonder if it can be easy to get so caught up in those disciplines or that one little corner of Christianity that it makes it really easy to do the same thing as Michelle with Michael, with everyone else. And say, you know what?
To other them.
You're not right. You're not doing it right. And this is, I know these beliefs. I know these doctrines. I know you're not doing it right. It's a hard question to ask. And I think all of us, if we were to dig deep, there's a lot of areas even outside of Christianity, especially politically, as we're kind of in this season right now, where we could even ask ourselves this question in that setting. You know, what am I hanging on to that's causing me to view people differently?
And how can we maybe miss where the Spirit's moving through them? I think is a big one. That kind of leads me to where what I take out of this, which is I see David dancing as his act of worship, right? And worship, the worship wars is something that was always talked about when I was coming up. Styles of worship.
The real Greek controversy.
Sure. And the truth is that what I see here is the blessing of the Lord does not come from necessarily the style of worship that David does. David dances. God doesn't seem displeased with that. But what I see is the result of that is this distribution of food, this bringing about, to take it all the way to where we are, this bringing about of what is in the kingdom of heaven we can slowly live out today, that there will be no hunger in the kingdom of heaven. So his worship leads them to distributing food to people who might have not had food. And so my thing is, I'm less about how are we doing our worship, or how are we, I think about a class I'm taking in seminary I took a few quarters ago, where we talked about the idea of a liturgy, which is like literally means the work of the people, where it's like what formation is the liturgy that we're doing in our church service every week bringing about, right? And if the formation is bringing about the distribution of food, the caring for those who are less fortunate, the uplifting of those who are on the street, then maybe that's true worship. Maybe that's the formation that we can bring about. Maybe that's the way that we can show people what the kingdom of heaven is all about, rather than, having a banger set, or having, the most traditional worship, or having, the best vibe. But
keeping
rather
the royal dignity.
Sure. Or keeping the royal dignity, or the religious dignity. But maybe it's about showing them what heaven is all about, which is, Jesus says, the least of these, I'm there with them.
That's good, man.
Just to go off of what I think you were hinting at, Kyle, just my closing thoughts, thinking about Michael or Michelle, and also kind of, I really like Michael Nixon. You were plenty to differentiate between Michael the wife and Michael Nixon. But just having a lot of compassion upon Michael and seeing her in that way. And I was just thinking about how also, wasn't she David's first wife as well?
Mm-hmm. I believe so.
And then seeing the wives that he slowly collects along the way, and just kind of wondering how much of that anxiety she's kind of bringing into this as well. I was just doing some research out of curiosity about attachment styles and how attachment styles affect our relationship with God as well as our relationship with other people. And this journal I was looking at was talking about how people who have an anxious style of attachment have a really hard time sitting with other people's beliefs and other people's way of life, and view that as a threat to their own. And so just kind of seeing how I wonder if she's kind of operating out of that, but then also kind of tying back to the conversation you're having, Kyle, about people sitting with other people who believe differently than them, and people who have an anxious attachment. Literally, they view other people's threats as a direct threat to their own belief system and can't sit with them in relationship. And I think that there's all sorts of implications for that in church setting. But I think the good news, the one good news out of that is that with just the kind of attachment theory, and if you guys know more about this, please tell me, but just from what I've seen with attachment theory, is that if you are in a relationship with someone who has a secure attachment, slowly over time, simply by being in relationship with that secure attachment person, you become more secure as a human being. And so relationships who are anxious and avoidant, they don't really work. But if an avoidant or an anxious person is in a relationship with a secure person, it slowly heals over time. So the implications of that as pastors then and people in leadership is to be working on our secure attachments. So when people lash out in anxiety, we don't feed into that anxiety. We don't say yes to that anxiety. We are a secure, calm, anxious presence to sit with that person in their anxiety or to sit with that person in their avoidance. And through hopefully the grace of God, slowly over time, they'll realize that my anxiety, the way that I'm lashing out, it's not working. It's like, it's not working. It's working in my relationships. It's not working here. And also hopefully training our local churches to become churches of secure attachment so that as people come to us, we are slowly healing their attachments, but then inadvertently heal their relationship with God, because we also bring our attachments to God. So, hopefully not having a reaction like David, who was like, oh, terrible person, I was doing the right thing. Like, what would have happened if David also didn't respond in his anxious attachment, but responded as a secure attachment? Just wondering how his relationship with Michael would have been healed. And also, yeah.
I think bringing up that bit about attachment theory is crazy in a good way. Because, not to share too much, I know I already talked, it's Nixon's turn, but there's only 4 of us, right?
Yeah.
We can go 40 minutes,
100%.
10 minutes each. Sorry, Rod. But that's kind of like what you explained is kind of my story, Emily. Like, I struggled a lot to view God. I think just in the last year, I've actually been able to accept that he's loving and accept these different things more fully because of that kind of anxious attachment style. And what healed it was people being consistent in my life and secure and listening, and then realizing that, okay, if David Sedlacek is that faithful and kind and willing to listen, shout out to Sedlacek,
love him,
Jesus must be like 100 times more than this guy. And just leaning into the voice that calls you the beloved so that you can develop a secure sense of self. And then you don't have to go out into the world operating under those systems that you were taught as a kid. So pro tip to anyone who is listening, if you find yourself in an anxious attachment style, what Emily said is so real and so true. Mike, what do you have for us, man, as you tie the bow for us?
There's so many bangers, so much good stuff. I think the thing that I'll land on is just getting back to, for me, my takeaway is, what is motivating my words? Is it contempt? Is it hatred? Is it lust? Is it, anxiety? Is it any of these things, or is it the Spirit of God? I think that this story is a beautiful reminder of the reality that we sometimes forget in church, is that it is not our job to correct or to refine or to conform people. We are not called to do that. We're called to uplift Christ and spread the gospel and point people towards Christ and his Spirit. And it's the Spirit who is called to correct, to guide into all truth. And so I believe that if I'm clear on the fact that the Spirit is motivating me to speak into someone's life, then I can be confident in knowing that the words that I'm going to speak to them will bring life. But as we see with the story of Michael, as the last verse alludes, it's really hard to produce life or to be productive in general when we're motivated by some of those different things that Emily was talking about, by anxiety, by fear, by hatred, by contempt. In the church setting and relationships, it's going to be much more difficult to produce life and love into others when we're motivated by the wrong motives. And so that's the big takeaway for me.
That's good. This was all good. It's interesting that this story, we could just keep going and going and going and going, but that's been every story, I think, in this whole Margins experience.
It's crazy.
For joining us. And yeah, it is. And as we close today, there's just one verse I want to read, and it's verse 22, and it's David. And after he's kind of like, I'm the king, we started with that text. So I want to bring us back over there. He says, I will make myself more contemptible than this, and I will be abased in your eyes, talking about Michael, but by the female servants of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor. And I wanted to end us on this note because it's a reminder, I think, that there's a contrast in every church. There's a contrast in every gathering of people where there's going to be people who are like Michael, and then there's going to be people who are like the servants who are seeing it from a different perspective. Each will have their own perspective. Each will have their own view of things. And I think the question we can all take with us into the rest of the week, but also into our communities as we take part in Ekklesia, is which lens will we choose to see people through? Are we going to be the kind of more critical person who's pulling out this microscope to look and say, I don't agree with that. I don't think that's right. I don't think this is good. Or will we be more like the servants where, according to David, it sounds to me like they were curious, like they were open. They were willing to see something new happening. And that doesn't mean that the other people are wrong or that they're right necessarily, but are we willing to sit in that tension? I think that's what I want to leave us with today. I want to thank you all for joining us again. Thanks for being a part of this community. Michael, Emily, John, thanks for joining us and being faithful week after week. And I'm excited as we continue heading into the rest of this series to see where God's going to take us and where we're going to keep growing. But with that said, I'm going to close this off with a word of prayer. God, we thank you for the time we've had together. It's been amazing to jump into your word once again. It's always challenging, and it always leaves a beautiful taste in my mouth, but also a bitter one because there's so much I have to fix in my own life when I read your word. And so we thank you that we don't have to worry about that. We can just focus on you and trust that as we join in this whole journey together as a community, you will walk with us. We ask you this in your name. Amen.
Amen.
See y'all next time.